Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'eretz. This is how the Torah begins. The very first thing I'll note is that I think Genesis 1:1 is given an incorrect verse division. This is because the first verse, as we have it, was thought to be a complete sentence, then followed by what we now have as verse 2. But if we know well what it means, then we know that verse 3 is the result of verse 1, and verse 2 is the completion of what had begun being described. In other words, I'll be talking about verses 1 and 2, since verse 2 should really be considered the second half of verse 1. The Latin Vulgate was an extremely powerful influence on the way people viewed and interpreted the Hebrew Bible. So it bears noting what it says or how it says it, so that we understand where a lot of ideological grounding is based upon. It reads as follows. In principio creavit Deus caelum et terram. Terra autem erat inanis et vacua, et tenebrae erant super faciam abyssi, et spiritus Dei fervatur super aquas. Translated to English, that is, in the first moment God created heaven and earth. The earth also was inane and vacant, and darknesses were upon the face of the abyss, and the Spirit of God bore over the waters. Firstly, the Vulgate suggests that this creation was the start of time and insinuates that everything between heaven and earth, and including heaven and earth, were created out of nothing. Secondly, not only is tenebrae plural, but the verb along with it, erant, is a plural indicator. I'm sure someone could interpret from the Latin that the darknesses were the many evil forces and demons contending with God before they were cast down, but this is not a sound interpretation, just one I find interesting. The earliest English translations, such as Elfric's, would be rendered into modern speech as, "In the beginning God shaped heaven and earth." It also bears noting that the first Anglo-Saxon translations of the Bible were done so from the Latin rather than from Hebrew. In 1611, the King James translators, this time working from Hebrew, rendered the text as follows. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And popular translations today rendered the text as something like, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And among all the modern translations, I think the NJPS, the New Jewish Publication Society, does a much better job. When God began to create heaven and earth, the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God sweeping over the water, and of course verse 3 continues it from there. Robert Alter's translation is, I think, among the absolute best translations of the Bible into English, and comes closest to the rhythm and poetic feel of the original Hebrew. If you're someone who's interested in Bible scholarship, then I highly recommend reading Robert Alter's version of the Tanakh, as it's not just a translation, but is filled with copious and insightful commentary and notes on the translation process. Alter's Genesis starts like this. When God began to create heaven and the earth then was welter and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters. And again the full sentence is completed in verse 3. So those are some different ways of looking at Genesis 1 through 2. But I have a translation of my own, and for reasons that I might cover in another video, I find the existing translations in publication, even the ones that I find better and more accurate than others, to be deficient. Even Alter's translation capitulates to the conventions and expectations of the devotional audience. For example, maintaining the ridiculous practice of rendering Yahweh as Lord. So this is the best translation of Genesis 1 through 2 that I could possibly come up with. When El began to shape the skies and the earth having become wrecked and a desolate waste, with murk over the face of Tehom, a wind from El swept upon the face of the waters. And now I'm going to dive into the text word by word and give the meaning of the Hebrew, explain why I chose the translation that I did, and elucidate the context and cultural significance of each part. The first word is Bereshit. Genesis begins with a temporal clause. If we were to use the phrase in the beginning, if we had to, then the only correct way to do that would be to say in the beginning of, such as in the beginning of God's creating. This beginning with a temporal clause parallels the Enuma Elish, which begins with when the height of heaven was not named and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name. Elohim is the generic biblical word for God, but stems from the Canaanite god El, the chief god of the pantheon, Most High, Father of the gods, and the Creator. The next word is bara, which means to shape. Most of the Old English and Germanic translations use this word shape or its cognate to translate bara. In Luther's German translation, it's am Anfang schuf Gott. The reason I think this is a better translation of bara than create is because in colloquial modern speech, we tend to think of creativity as synonymous with originality, and the creative process as bringing about something new, bringing something into existence. Well, that sense of the text is more in accordance with the Latin rendering than it is with the original Hebrew. The Latin version is greatly responsible for the creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, interpretation of the Bible. The Hebrew continues on with the shaping motif until El gets to shaping humans with clay, very anthropomorphically like with hands. Also, shape as a verb is a homophone for shape as a noun, as in the form or figure of something, so I find this translation to be more fitting. The next word is shamayim, the skies. The im ending makes it plural. It's what's called a plurale tantum, a word used always in the plural form but with a singular meaning. There is no evidence that suggests the ancient Israelites believed in multiple heavens or in multiple layers of heaven. What this is, however, and the reason I think the plural should be preserved, is because the im ending suggests multiplicity to convey the great measure and the vastness of the sky. The verb haya is in the past tense. Haya is often translated here as was, but more accurately it means to become, or break into a given state, come to pass, or cause, or come about. It takes a pre-existing state into a subsequent state. Tohu comes from a root meaning to lay waste to. Refers to something laid waste, a wasteland, a place made to be in a state of disarray, away from its prior form, or, as we would succinctly say, destroyed. Here I use the word wrecked. I find it gives the best sense of the word tohu and conveys the same tone. The next word is choshech, not mere darkness, but literally means obscurity, in this sense like muddy water. The English word I can think of that best conveys this clouded obscurity is murk, or murkiness. The next word is tehom. Now, this is one of the most significant issues I find in all the translations. To translate this as the deep is simply improper. There is no definite article, and the word here is a proper noun. It refers to and is a cognate with Tiamat, the primordial water goddess against which the storm war god fights and destroys, then uses the corpse to fashion the world. She is that which pre-existed the creation mentioned in this account. An equivalent concept would be Leviathan, which always gets preserved in transliteration, so why not Tehom? This also relates back to bara, which, again, takes a pre-existing state into a subsequent state. In fact, in Joshua 17:15, bara is translated as cut down. So when we think of the Genesis 1 creation account, think of it like cutting down a tree to make a table. You didn't create the tree out of nothing. You used it, having already been there, and transformed it into a new shape. Ruach is not spirit, but rather it means wind or breath. Mind-body dualism that is found in most translations is anachronistic to the original Hebrew texts and their religion. As Robert Alter points out, the Hebrew concept of the spirit is actually visceral and not differentiated from the breath. But in this case, as we know it is a parallel and borrowed motif from the Mesopotamian creation accounts, we also know that it is not just any breath, but the wind used to kill the primordial water goddess Tiamat. Rahaf means to move swiftly, flap, or perhaps even flutter. But in the poetic sense, and in keeping with the tone, I have this as the past tense of sweep. Panim translates to face. It's often translated as surface, but it's not an abstract geometric plane. It literally refers to someone's face, their countenance. The wind is blasting into the face, as described in the Enuma Elish when Marduk splits Tiamat asunder. Lastly, we have mayim, waters. In the Hebrew, this is also a synonym for danger, violence, or transitory things. This is, of course, referring back to Tehom, the primordial waters.